The smell reached us 3 days before the convoy did. Sweetness mixed with copper, thick enough to coat your teeth when you breathed. I was standing watch on the outer wall when the wind shifted, and that's when I knew the promissory seals meant nothing. The regional governor had sent his personal guarantee, embossed parchment 3 meters long signed in his own blood, that the military garrison would arrive before the raids resumed. I held that document in my hands while the first scream tore through the morning air, high and wet, coming from the grain silos where old Mectus had been filling sacks for the tithe. I was not born to understanding. My father worked the water reclamation plants beneath the city, and my mother died birthing my sister in a Medicaid station that stank of disinfectant and rust. I learned early that protection was a word officials used when they meant delay. The garrison was supposed to arrive on the 15th day of the solar month. They sent a Vox transmission on the 14th explaining that convoy discipline required an additional week of preparation. The raiders came that night. We heard them before we saw them. Not the vehicles, those stayed silent, engines cut, rolling on momentum down the valley approach. But the singing. They sang in a language I didn't recognize, rhythmic and low, like a work chant or a prayer. The sound carried over the perimeter wall and settled into the streets of our settlement like cold water seeping through fabric. I was in the command bunker by then, promoted to watch captain after the previous captain caught the wasting fever. My predecessor left me his uniform, his pistol, and a ledger, documenting every promise the administratum had made to our district over the past 30 years. Every promise was broken. Every date was revised, every seal was decorative. The first attack lasted 6 hours. They breached the eastern gate using shaped charges that melted the hinges into slag. Our militia, farmers and factory workers with hunting rifles and ceremonial lasguns, issued for the emperor's birthday celebrations, held the entrance for perhaps 20 minutes. I watched through the bunker's observation slit as Javek, who'd taught me to shoot when I was 12, took a round through the throat and tried to hold his neck together with both hands. The blood came out between his fingers in spurts timed to his heartbeat. He looked directly at me. I looked away. The raiders wore armor that reflected nothing. Not light, not sound, just a visual absence that made your eyes slide past them like water off waxed canvas. They moved through our streets with the efficiency of abattoir workers, selecting targets according to criteria I couldn't discern. They took the young, but not all the young. They ignored the elderly but killed 3 of the retired administratum clerks who'd come to our settlement for their final years. They burned the chapel but left the grain stores intact. They spent 40 minutes in the Medicaid station doing something that made the building's windows glow orange from within. No one who was inside came out. When they withdrew at dawn, they left markers. Carved stones placed at intersections, each inscribed with a symbol that hurt to look at directly, not because it was obscene or violent, but because it suggested geometries that didn't resolve properly in peripheral vision. The settlement elder, a woman named Thessia who'd survived 3 previous raids over her 80 years, ordered the stones destroyed. We tried hammers first. The weapons rebounded with enough force to break Corin's wrist. We tried the industrial drill from the mining concern's equipment depot. The drill bit shattered. The stone remained unmarked. Eventually we painted over them with whitewash and tried not to walk too close. The Vox transmission from the regional capital came 6 days later. A bureaucrat with a voice like dried paper explained that the convoy had been diverted to address a labor uprising in another district. Our protection detail would arrive within the month, pending resolution of the uprising and completion of the requisite transportation requisition forms. He asked us to provide a detailed casualty report, itemized by age, occupation, and tithe contribution level. I spent 2 days compiling the list. 47 dead, 16 missing. The youngest was 4 years old. The oldest was 91. The bureaucrat's follow-up message thanked us for our thoroughness. and requested that future reports use the updated form template, which had been revised to include 3 additional data fields. I stopped sleeping after that. Not from fear. Fear would have been clean, purposeful. I stopped because sleep meant dreaming, and dreaming meant seeing Javek's eyes on me again, that look of pure incomprehension as his brain processed the reality of his own throat opening. I took to walking the wall at night, listening to the settlement breathe. You could hear it if you stayed still, the collective sound of 3,000 people trying to exist quietly enough that the darkness wouldn't notice them. Children learned to cry without sound. Adults moved through streets with their footsteps muffled by strips of torn cloth wrapped around their boots. We dimmed our lights, we rationed our speech, we made ourselves small. The second attack came 19 days after the first. This time they didn't bother with the gate. They came over the wall using grapples that made no sound when they bit into stone. I was in the command bunker when the first report crackled over the Vox, raiders in the southern quarter, moving toward the residential blocks. I mobilized the militia, such as it was, 37 men and women with weapons that hadn't been maintained properly in decades. We reached the southern quarter in time to find the raiders already withdrawing. They'd taken no one. They'd killed no one. They'd simply entered 12 homes and moved the furniture. Chairs stacked on tables, beds rotated 90 degrees, kitchen implements arranged in patterns on floors, concentric circles of knives and spoons and cutting boards. The psychological effect was immediate. People began moving out of the affected homes, crowding into already cramped spaces with relatives and neighbors. Arguments erupted over resources, over space, over nothing. A man named Dullen stabbed his brother-in-law through the lung with a screwdriver during a dispute about water rations. The Medicaid staff, reduced to a single qualified practitioner and 2 assistants, managed to save him, but the wound suppurated despite treatment. He died 4 days later, calling for his wife, who'd been taken in the first raid. I sent another Vox transmission to the regional capital. This time, I didn't request assistance, I demanded it. I invoked every regulatory statute I could find in my predecessor's ledger, every clause and subcallus that obligated the administratum to provide defense for settlements meeting tithe requirements. We'd met every requirement. We'd exceeded quotas for 3 consecutive years. We'd provided the requested casualty reports, the damage assessments, the resource inventories. We'd done everything correctly. The response came from a different bureaucrat, this one with a voice like cold syrup. He informed me that my tone was inappropriate for an official of my rank, that insubordination was documented in my permanent record, and that the garrison would arrive when transportation and scheduling permitted. He did not provide a date. The third attack came 11 days later, at midday, while the settlement gathered for the mandatory loyalty recitation. The raiders walked through the front gate while we stood in the square with our hands over our hearts, reciting the words we'd memorized before we learned to read. They passed among us like smoke through fingers. They touched no one. They killed no one. They walked to the center of the square and stood in silence while we recited. When we finished, they turned and left. The elder, Thessia, collapsed immediately afterward. Cardiac arrest, the Medicaid practitioner said, stress-induced. She was dead before they carried her inside. I knew then what was happening. Not the tactical details, those remained opaque, but the strategic architecture. They weren't raiding us, they were training us. Each attack taught us our helplessness in a new register. Each withdrawal demonstrated their control. The markers they'd left weren't threats, they were ownership claims. The furniture arrangements weren't vandalism. They were lessons in penetration, in the impossibility of secure space. Their daylight visit to the square was the clearest communication yet. Your rituals mean nothing. Your collective identity is performance. Your oaths protect nobody. The garrison arrived 34 days after the first attack. 12 armored vehicles, 80 soldiers in gray-green uniforms, and a commander whose face had the smooth, ageless quality of someone who'd undergone extensive juvenile treatments. He established his command post in the bunker and called me in for a briefing. I provided everything I had: attack patterns, casualty figures, descriptions of the raiders' equipment and tactics. He listened without interrupting, his expression fixed in the neutral mask of professional competence. When I finished, he thanked me for my thoroughness and explained that his orders were to establish a defensive perimeter and wait for additional intelligence from regional command. I asked how long that would take. He said he didn't have that information. I asked what we were supposed to do in the meantime. He said we should maintain normal operations and report any unusual activity through proper channels. The fourth attack came 3 days after the garrison's arrival. The raiders hit the garrison's motor pool at dawn, destroying 8 vehicles with charges that turned armor plating into flower petals of twisted metal. They killed 11 soldiers and wounded 16 more. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes. The garrison commander called me into his post afterward, and I saw something new in his face, the realization that his training and equipment meant precisely as much as our hunting rifles and hope. He said nothing about it directly. Instead, he informed me that he'd requested additional forces and that we should prepare for a protracted engagement. I asked what preparation looked like. He didn't answer. The pattern became routine. The raiders would strike every 7 to 11 days, varying their targets and methods enough to prevent prediction but maintaining enough consistency to ensure we never stopped anticipating. They killed the garrison's communications officer while he slept, cutting his throat so precisely that he bled out without waking his bunkmate 2 meters away. They poisoned the water supply with something that caused temporary blindness and vomiting but killed no one. They abducted a child from the garrison commander's protection detail, a girl he'd brought with him, daughter of a dead comrade, and returned her 3 days later, unharmed, speaking in that same rhythmic language we'd heard them singing. She couldn't or wouldn't explain what happened. She stopped speaking our language entirely after that. I began keeping a separate ledger, one I didn't report to the administratum. I documented things I wasn't sure were real, patterns I thought I saw in the raiders' movements, correlations between attack timing and astronomical phenomena, the way certain streets seemed darker than others even at midday. I noted the settlement's deterioration, not the physical damage, which was substantial but repairable, but the internal collapse. People stopped maintaining their homes. Parents stopped disciplining children. The daily loyalty recitation became a mumbled formality, words spoken with eyes fixed on the ground. 3 residents committed suicide in a single week, hanging themselves from support beams in the factory district. No one held services. The bodies were processed according to regulation and recycled for their chemical components, and we returned to waiting. The garrison commander called me in on the 53rd day. He looked like he'd aged a decade since his arrival. Whatever juvenile treatments had preserved his appearance were failing under sustained stress. He told me that regional command had acknowledged his requests for additional support but provided no timeline for deployment. He told me that his current orders were to maintain position and continue monitoring the situation. He told me very quietly that those orders were insane. He told me he was going to withdraw his forces within the week and recommend that the settlement be evacuated and the territory ceded to hostile control. He told me this would probably result in his court-martial and execution, but that he saw no alternative. He asked if I understood. I told him I did. He asked if I agreed. I told him agreement was irrelevant. The garrison withdrew 6 days later, at dawn, moving with the kind of disciplined haste that suggested routed forces rather than tactical repositioning. The commander left me a copy of his final report to regional command, perhaps as a kindness or perhaps as evidence. The document was comprehensive and damning. It detailed the administratum's failure to provide timely support, the inadequacy of intelligence about the raiders, the strategic impossibility of defending the settlement with available resources. It concluded with a recommendation that the entire district be classified as a contested zone and quarantined pending a major offensive operation. He estimated such an operation would require 6 months of planning and a commitment of forces that regional command was unlikely to authorize. In other words, we were being abandoned according to proper procedure. The settlement held a meeting after the garrison left. What remained of us anyway, perhaps 2,000 people now, the rest dead or fled or simply gone in ways we couldn't track. We gathered in the same square where the raiders had walked among us during our recitation. The silence was absolute. No one wanted to speak first, to be the one who articulated the obvious. Finally, a young woman named Kess, she'd lost her husband and both children in the first raid, stood and said what we were all thinking: we should surrender. Someone asked how you surrender to an enemy that makes no demands. She had no answer. Someone else suggested we abandon the settlement and flee to the capital. Someone pointed out that the capital was 600 kilometers away across hostile terrain, and that we had perhaps a dozen functioning vehicles and no fuel reserves. Someone suggested we fortify what remained and fight. Someone else laughed, a sound like glass breaking. I returned to the command bunker and sat at the desk where the garrison commander had sat, where I'd sat, where my predecessor had sat before the wasting fever took him. I opened the ledgers, both the official one and my private documentation, and I read through them start to finish, looking for the thing I'd missed, the pattern or anomaly that would make it all cohere into actionable intelligence. There was nothing. Or rather, there was only the truth I'd been documenting without acknowledging. We had never mattered. Not to the administratum, not to the regional governor, not to whatever power or ideology motivated the raiders. We were a line item in a budget, a casualty figure in a report, a settlement designation in an archive. Our suffering was procedurally acknowledged and strategically irrelevant. The fifth attack came that night. This time they didn't withdraw. They entered through every gate simultaneously, moving in organized columns, and they occupied the settlement with the casualness of people returning home. They didn't kill anyone immediately. They herded us into the square, the same square, always the same square, and they stood at the perimeter while we huddled together in the center. I counted them for the first time, 43 raiders, which meant they'd always been outnumbered but had leveraged our fear and isolation into an asymmetrical advantage. They stood in silence for perhaps an hour. Some of us wept, some prayed, some simply stared. I watched the way they moved, the way they oriented themselves, and I finally understood the geometries their markers had been describing. They weren't claiming territory, they were transforming it. The settlement had become something else, a trap, a test, a sacrifice zone. One of them approached me. I couldn't tell gender or age through the armor, but the movement suggested authority. It stopped perhaps 2 meters away and removed its helmet. The face beneath was human, more human than I'd expected, just a man in his 30s with tired eyes and a scar through his left eyebrow. He spoke in our language, accent-free, and asked if I was the watch captain. I said yes. He asked if I understood why they'd come. I said no. He nodded as though I'd answered correctly. He explained, in the patient tone of an instructor addressing a slow student, that their purpose was pedagogical. This district had failed to meet certain unspecified criteria, not tithe obligations or regulatory compliance, but something else, something he described as civilizational resonance. The administratum had flagged the territory for remediation, and his unit had been contracted to provide corrective pressure. The goal wasn't extermination but transformation. To stress test the settlement's cohesion, to identify social fractures, to document behavioral patterns under sustained threat. Every raid had been calibrated. Every casualty had been calculated. The promissory seals, the delayed garrison, the inadequate support, all designed to maximize our isolation and despair. We weren't victims of a bureaucratic failure. We were subjects in an administrative experiment. He told me this without malice or satisfaction, the way you'd explain a manufacturing process or a harvest schedule. He told me that the experiment was concluding, that sufficient data had been gathered, and that final disposition of the settlement would be determined by evaluators who would arrive within the month. He told me that my documentation, both official and private, had been monitored via the command bunker's compromised Vox system, and that my observations showed promising analytical clarity. He told me I was being offered a position with his unit contingent on my acceptance of certain ideological and behavioral conditioning protocols. He told me the alternative was remaining with the settlement through final disposition, the nature of which he was not authorized to disclose but which I should understand to be unfavorable. I asked about the others. He said the others were data points. I asked what happened to places that failed their experiments. He said they were administratively reclassified and their populations were redistributed according to labor demand projections. I asked if anyone would remember us. He said memory was not a priority function of the administratum. I asked if he'd done this before. He said 17 times. I asked if it got easier. He said no, but that difficulty was not a valid reason to refuse assigned duty. I looked at the people in the square. I saw Kess, who'd wanted to surrender. I saw Corin, whose wrist had never properly healed after trying to destroy the markers. I saw children who'd learned to cry silently and adults who'd learned to walk like ghosts. I saw Javik's widow, who hadn't spoken since the first raid. I saw the shape of what I'd become if I stayed, a casualty figure, a footnote, a failed watch captain who'd documented his own irrelevance. I saw the shape of what I'd become if I left, something else, something wearing my face and speaking with my voice, but operating according to logic that treated human suffering as methodology. The raider waited. The square was silent except for the wind moving through burned-out buildings. I thought about my predecessor's ledger, all those broken promises meticulously recorded. I thought about the promissory seal in my quarters, 3 meters of embossed parchment signed in blood that meant nothing. I thought about the official who'd revised the casualty report template, and the bureaucrat who'd documented my insubordination, and the garrison commander who'd withdrawn according to proper procedure. I thought about systems and mechanisms and the way power insulates itself from consequence by distributing responsibility until no single person can be held accountable. I thought about the word protection and the way it sounds like promise and means delay. I told him I accepted. The words came out steady, which surprised me. I'd expected my voice to break or catch, some physical rebellion against what I was saying. Nothing happened. The raider nodded and gestured toward his unit's formation. I walked toward them, and with each step I felt the settlement receding, not physically but conceptually, becoming abstract, becoming data. Behind me someone called my name. I didn't turn around. I had already begun the first lesson of my new position, the cultivation of productive distance, the discipline of seeing people as variables. They gave me armor that fit poorly and smelled of whoever wore it last. They gave me a weapon I didn't know how to maintain. They took me to a transport vehicle and secured me in a harness designed for someone larger. Through the window I watched the settlement shrink into insignificance, just another cluster of buildings in an empty landscape. I watched until I couldn't distinguish individual structures anymore, until it was just a smudge of gray against brown terrain. I watched until I couldn't see it at all. The conditioning protocols began that night. I won't describe them except to say that they were comprehensive and that by the 3rd day I understood why the raider had said it didn't get easier. They taught me to see patterns where before I'd seen chaos. They taught me to recognize the architecture of control systems and the mathematics of managed despair. They taught me that every human settlement is an experiment in social cohesion and that my previous role had been as both observer and observed, generating data through my suffering that would inform the next iteration of administrative policy. They taught me that the administratum is not a government, but a mechanism for processing human life into usable form, and that mechanisms have no malice, only function. I learned quickly. I had to. The alternative was remediation, which nobody explained, but which I understood to mean something terminal. They showed me reports from other settlements, other experiments. I recognized the patterns, the delayed protection, the calibrated attacks, the documentation requirements that turned atrocity into paperwork. I saw casualty reports formatted according to the latest templates. I saw before and after behavioral assessments. I saw footage of places that looked like my settlement in the before images and like abandoned ruins in the after. I saw what final disposition looked like. I said nothing. I absorbed the information and demonstrated proficiency in applying analytical frameworks to human suffering. On the 47th day of my conditioning, they told me I was ready for field assignment. They gave me a designation that replaced my name. They gave me access to operational files and strategic briefings. They told me that my first assignment would involve establishing baseline behavioral norms for a settlement in the eastern districts. Population approximately 4,000, tithe compliance exceeding quotas for 5 consecutive years. They showed me the settlement's location on a map. They showed me the promissory seals that had been issued. They told me that protection had been promised and that the garrison was experiencing logistical delays. They asked if I understood my role. I said yes. They asked if I had questions. I said no. I lied. I had one question, but I didn't ask it because I already knew the answer. The question was whether the cycle ever ended, whether there was some threshold beyond which the administratum would be satisfied with its data and allow settlements to exist without being transformed into laboratories for administrative science. I knew the answer was no because I'd read enough reports to understand that the system sustained itself through continuous testing, that every iteration generated new questions requiring new experiments, that human suffering was not a problem to be solved but a resource to be managed and optimized. They sent me to my first assignment 3 days later. I traveled with a unit of 17 others, all of them conditioned, all of them wearing faces that looked human but operated according to inhuman logic. We reviewed the settlement's profile during transport. It reminded me of my own: agricultural base, light manufacturing, loyal population, exceeded quotas, aging infrastructure, minimal defense capability. Perfect for stress testing, perfect for transformation. We arrived at night, engines cut, rolling on momentum. We began singing as we approached, that same rhythmic chant in the language that had terrified me when I'd first heard it. Now I understood the words. They meant nothing. The song was just pressure, just the sound of inevitability approaching. I sang with them. My voice blended with theirs until I couldn't distinguish which sounds I was making and which were coming from the others. We breached the eastern gate using shaped charges that melted the hinges into slag. The militia responded exactly as predicted, farmers and factory workers with inadequate weapons and no tactical training. They held the entrance for 18 minutes. I monitored their communications and documented their defensive positions and watched a young man take a round through the throat and try to hold his neck together with both hands. The blood came out between his fingers in spurts timed to his heartbeat. He looked toward the command bunker where their watch captain was observing. His eyes held that same pure incomprehension I'd seen in Javek's face. I recorded the casualty in my log: male, approximately 25 years old, probable militia volunteer, death by exsanguination following arterial perforation. Operationally insignificant. Behaviorally typical. I noted that the watch captain had looked away and documented this as evidence of inadequate psychological conditioning for command responsibility under stress. I flagged it for inclusion in my final report. We withdrew at dawn according to plan. We left markers at the intersections, carved stones inscribed with geometries that didn't resolve properly. They'd try to destroy them. The stones would endure. They always did. We returned to our forward position and began preparing for the second phase of operations. I compiled my initial observations and transmitted them through proper channels. An evaluator acknowledged receipt and noted that my documentation showed promising analytical clarity. I was commended for my thoroughness. That night I lay in my bunk and tried to remember what I'd felt during my first raid when I was on the other side of the wall. I couldn't access it. The conditioning had been comprehensive. I could recall the facts, the dates, the casualties, the progression of events, but the emotional content had been extracted like a tumor, leaving only clean scar tissue. I thought about Javek and Corin and Kess and all the others. I thought about the watch captain in the settlement we'd just attacked, documenting everything carefully, believing that thoroughness mattered. I thought about the moment, perhaps 50 days from now, when one of us would approach him in the square and explain that his suffering had been pedagogical. I thought about whether he'd accept the offer. I knew he would. Not because everyone does, some refuse and accept final disposition, but because the ones who survive long enough to receive the offer have already demonstrated the psychological flexibility required. You don't document your way through sustained atrocity unless part of you is already capable of transforming horror into data. The conditioning just makes it permanent, gives it purpose, integrates it into a system. The watch captain below me right now, writing in his ledger, recording each broken promise, he's already becoming what I became. He just doesn't know it yet. The screams started on the third day. Not from the settlement, we hadn't attacked again yet, but from inside my own skull. Phantom echoes of sounds I should remember but couldn't quite access. The conditioning was supposed to prevent this. I mentioned it to the unit Medicaid during a routine assessment. She noted it in my file and told me that residual neural feedback was common during initial field assignments, that it would diminish with continued exposure. She asked if it affected my operational capability. I said no. She said then it wasn't a problem. The second attack went exactly as planned. We entered 12 homes and rearranged the furniture. We killed no one. We took no one. We left and waited for the psychological deterioration to manifest. It took 6 days. A man stabbed his brother-in-law during an argument about water rations. The settlement's watch captain transmitted a demand, not a request, a demand, to the regional capital, invoking regulatory statutes that meant nothing. The response documented his insubordination, everything proceeding according to pattern. I documented it all, the behavioral breakdown, the social fractures, the way isolation and sustained low-intensity stress eroded collective cohesion more efficiently than direct violence. I noted which residents fled and which remained, which turned aggressive and which catatonic. I compiled it into clean prose and transmitted it through channels and received commendation for my analytical clarity. The evaluators were pleased, the data was valuable, the experiment was succeeding. The garrison arrived on schedule, which is to say, late enough to be useless but early enough to generate hope. We destroyed 8 of their vehicles on the 3rd day of their deployment. We killed 11 soldiers. We abducted the commander's ward and returned her speaking our language, everything according to pattern. The garrison commander realized he'd walked into something he couldn't solve with training and equipment. He withdrew. He left behind a report recommending evacuation and quarantine. The recommendation would be filed and forgotten. The settlement would continue generating data until final disposition. I should clarify what final disposition means. They never told me explicitly, but I've inferred from contextual evidence and redacted sections in archived reports. The settlements aren't destroyed. That would waste resources. They're repurposed. The populations are transferred to labor camps or penal colonies or experimental facilities where their continued suffering serves additional administrative functions. The infrastructure is catalogued and reassigned. The territory is reclassified. The documentation is archived for future reference. The mechanism processes everything into usable form. Nothing is wasted. We're approaching that phase now. The settlement has degraded to the point where further data collection offers diminishing returns. The evaluators will arrive soon to conduct final assessments and determine optimal repurposing strategies. I'll be reassigned to a new settlement, a new experiment. The cycle continues. I've been told that after sufficient field experience, I may qualify for evaluator training, which represents a promotion in both status and compensation. I've been told this as though it's an incentive. I'm not sure what they think motivates me anymore. The watch captain is beginning to understand. I've been monitoring his Vox communications and reading his logs, both official and private. He's reached the point where he's documenting things he's not sure are real. He's seeing patterns. He's noticing correlations. He's keeping records that the administratum doesn't require. He's doing exactly what I did, which means he's ready or nearly ready. When we occupy the settlement next week, I'll be the one who approaches him. I'll remove my helmet and explain his situation using the patient tone of an instructor addressing a slow student. I'll offer him the choice I was offered. I'll watch his face as he processes the revelation that his suffering was designed, that every broken promise was calculated, that he never mattered except as data. I wonder if he'll recognize me. Probably not. The conditioning changes more than psychology. It affects posture, expression, the subtle markers of identity. I'm not the person I was. That person died in the square when I walked away from the people who'd called my name. What remains is functionally equivalent but structurally different, like a building that's been demolished and rebuilt, using the same materials but a different blueprint. The screams haven't stopped. They're getting louder, actually. Not external. I'm certain now that they're only in my head. Neurological artifacts. The sound of the person I was trying to reach, the person I've become. The Medicae says it's not affecting my operational capability. She's right. I perform my duties with exemplary precision. I document everything according to protocol. I apply analytical frameworks without hesitation. I sing when we approach settlements at night, my voice blending with the others. The screams are just background noise, a technical problem without operational significance. They promised protection. That's what all the settlements are told. The promissory seals, the embossed parchment, the signatures in blood, they're part of the experimental design. The promise establishes baseline expectations, and the breaking of those promises generates measurable psychological responses. The delays, the inadequate support, the bureaucratic indifference, these aren't failures, they're features. The system works exactly as intended. The settlements suffer precisely as much as they're meant to suffer. The data gets collected. The mechanism continues processing human life into usable form. Next week I'll stand in another square and watch another watch captain realize what he's become. I'll extend the same offer I accepted. He'll probably accept it too, because by that point he'll already be capable of the distance required. He'll walk toward us while someone behind him calls his name. He won't turn around. He'll begin the conditioning protocols. Within 50 days he'll be standing where I'm standing, approaching someone else in another square in another settlement that exceeded quotas and did everything correctly and suffered anyway. The screams started, and they never stopped. They promised they would. The conditioning was supposed to eliminate this kind of residual response. But either the promises meant nothing, or I'm fundamentally resistant to the protocols, or the screams aren't really in my head at all, but are actually the sound the mechanism makes when it processes human life, a sound nobody mentions because we've all agreed not to hear it. I don't know which. I document everything, but I can't document this because there's no template for reporting that the system itself is screaming. I'll make the offer next week. The watch captain will accept, or he won't. The settlement will reach final disposition. The evaluators will arrive. I'll be reassigned. The cycle will continue. Somewhere a promissory seal is being prepared for a settlement that doesn't know it's about to become a laboratory. Somewhere a garrison is being delayed. Somewhere a watch captain is standing on a wall, smelling copper and sweetness on the wind, holding a guarantee that means nothing. about to learn that protection was always just another word for what happens while you wait to be processed. The mechanism has no malice. It only has function. I've been integrated into that function. I perform it precisely, and deep in whatever remains of the structure that used to be me, in spaces the conditioning couldn't quite reach, something is screaming. It's been screaming since the square. It will still be screaming when I approach the next watch captain and see my own incomprehension reflected in his face. They promised protection. The screams started anyway. They'll never stop. That's the final lesson, the one they don't teach during conditioning, because you have to learn it yourself. The screaming is permanent. You just learn to function anyway. You learn to sing while you approach. You learn to see people as variables. You learn to call it duty instead of horror. You learn that the choice you made in the square wasn't really a choice at all, but just the moment when you stopped pretending you had any option except collaboration or extinction. I chose collaboration. I tell myself I chose it. But choice implies alternatives, and the mechanism doesn't permit alternatives. It only permits the illusion of choice, which generates more useful data than simple coercion. Everything is useful, everything is processed, everything becomes part of the function. Next week, another settlement, another watch captain, another square, another offer, another person learning what I learned. The mechanism processing itself through us, generation after generation, converting human life into something administratively manageable. No end, no threshold. Just continuous testing, continuous transformation, continuous screaming that nobody acknowledges because acknowledgement would disrupt operations. They promised protection. I believed them once. Now I'm the thing that follows broken promises, walking through gates at night while people wait inside for help that isn't coming. I'm what protection looks like from the other side, not safety but the appearance of process, not defense but managed decline, not salvation but optimal repurposing of casualties into data. The screams are loudest when I'm almost asleep, that moment between consciousness and the nothing the conditioning put where dreams used to be. They rise up from whichever part of me survived the protocols, and they sound like Javek choking, like Kes asking how you surrender, like someone calling my name in a square while I walk away. They sound like the question I never asked, does the cycle ever end? They sound like the answer I already knew. No, it doesn't end. There's just function continuing forever, processing everything into usable form. And somewhere in that mechanism, wearing my face and carrying my designation, I'm screaming with all the others, everyone who accepted the offer, everyone who chose collaboration over extinction, everyone who learned to sing while approaching and to see people as variables and to call it duty instead of horror. We're all screaming. We just learn not to let it affect operational capability. We learn to function anyway. That's what makes us valuable. That's what makes us different from the people in the squares, waiting for protection that's actually just the sound of the mechanism approaching. They promised protection. The screams started anyway. They'll never stop. That's not a problem. That's just function continuing as designed.